Hi, good morning.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, we're going to start. So I'm going to do a little intro now, and I want to welcome all of you to the biannual SoCal Social Work Women's Conference on Law and Ethics. I must say that it's actually really different not to see you, our audience. I trust that you're all there. I know some of you have been coming for 20 years, even getting on the train from other counties very early in the morning. Now you could wake up, turn on your screen, drink your coffee, but I do miss seeing you. My name's Brenda Wewell, and I'm the chair of the council. We've been providing this law and ethics training, Is Legal Always Ethical, for over 20 years. The council is a volunteer group of women who meet bi-monthly for a stimulating discussion and take action on issues we care about. Most recently, I'm really proud that we prepared and advocated for a resolution on public safety and social justice that was actually adopted recently by the state NASW chapter. I'd like to especially thank our member, Laura Hernández, who took on the job of learning our platform and has set everything up beautifully. She's our official site host for today, and we're very grateful for her technical abilities as well as dedication. I'd also like to thank Hillary Marshall, who's doing our timekeeping, and Debbie Murad, who's going to be monitoring our question and answer, both longtime members of the Women's Council. So this conference, full title, is Defining Anti-Racist Social Work in the Context of Capitalist Systems and How We Work Towards Liberation. Now, I know that's quite a mouthful, but I hope you will enjoy the program we've prepared with amazing speakers today. It's directed at providing an educational overview, practical experience, and some suggestions you can try. Our last conference was held on March 1st, 2020, just before the COVID-19 lockdowns. And this is our very first using this virtual format. So we ask for your patience just in case something doesn't work right. Like I couldn't get into the platform until 2 minutes before 8:30. We're still learning. As a group of feminist social workers, we've been exploring racism within social and human service systems for quite a while, and especially over the last couple of years. Given that the American legal system sanctions and integrates racist policies and practices that are reinforced within a capitalist system of profit making, we explore how that context challenges our social work ethics, where we feel a strong ethical push to fight racism and the resulting disparities in all aspects of life that are the result. This fundamental imbalance between the law and our ethics is at the core of the battles we fight and the injustices we confront as social workers. We're glad you've joined us for this discussion because we need more voices and support as we explore ways to understand ourselves and our communities and work towards something better. I'd like to include a land acknowledgement recognizing the history of American colonization and esteemed traditions of our Native American ancestors. The Social Work Women's Council recognizes the Gabrieleño Tongva as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. Here is a part of a traditional prayer to the ancestors, giving thanks for the 8 directions, east, west, north, south, heaven, earth, that is which in me, and that which connects me with all those I come in contact, including all of you out there in our audience. This 3-hour session is the first of 2. The second 3-hour session will be held on May 20th. You can attend one or both, earning 3 CEUs for each, with a total of 6 if you attend both days, which satisfies the biannual Law and Ethics BBS licensure requirement. Once this session is ended, you can return to the landing page to complete your evaluation. For those who did not sign up for CEUs, you'll still receive a letter documenting your attendance. You can also return to the landing page at any time to download session materials or obtain contact info for technical assistance. A few more housekeeping announcements. The Zoom chat is disabled during most of the session, and attendee microphones are muted to reduce distractions. We encourage questions for the speakers and have scheduled time at the end of each presentation. You'll have access to the question and answer box throughout the session. We'll monitor the questions and ask as many to the speakers as possible within our time limits. Finally, you may not feel comfortable with some of the material or ideas we're presenting. This work is part of a personal as well as professional journey, and we encourage you to engage in mindful self-care and self-compassion throughout. Now for our program. I'm so happy to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Renee Smith-Maddox. She's one of my very favorite people. I look up to her a lot. At the University of Southern California, she studied, taught, and provided transformational leadership on diversity at all levels throughout the university and the school. She's a clinical professor and diversity liaison for the USC Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work, teaching at the social work master's and doctorate programs online and on ground, as well as engaging as a strategist, DEI learning lab design expert, anti-trafficking advocate, and champion of empowerment and leadership initiatives for social change. So here she is.
Thank you, Brenda, and welcome, greetings, and I am honored to be here. I want to give thanks to the council, the planning committee, particularly those who ushered me through the process of getting ready for this presentation. Carrie and Brenda, thank you very much. And I give thanks always to my ancestors, because it's through them that I'm able to be here. As I thought about today and thought about the theme for this conference, I thought that besides hearing my bio, there was a way in which I'd like to introduce who I am to you and to let you know a little bit about where I'm from. I'm from hot sauce, plantains, sorrel, codfish cakes. I'm from the Caribbean, the South, and New York City, the Big Apple, the concrete jungle where dreams are made up. I'm from hopscotch, double dutch, hula hoop, handball, and other street games played in Brooklyn, New York. I'm from jazz, Motown, reggae, R&B, and hip hop. I'm from the joy I share with my family and friends. I'm from a small middle-class family with a heart of gold. I'm from the training of my grandmother, who understood the power of prayer and giving back. I'm from a phenomenal woman and someone who represents an endangered species. I'm from 2 African Americans who got divorced because of irreconcilable differences. I'm from the intersection of many identities that are visible, but still I rise. I'm from opportunities, preparation, and hard work. I'm from an era of messages that remind me of the duty of Black intellectuals to create a career with a positive impact. I'm from the souls of Black folks dealing with the realities of double consciousness. I'm from the bond of my past that's rooted in pain and alienation. I'm from ancestors who struggled and people who still struggle for freedom, social justice, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm from the dreams and radical hope of Martin, Malcolm, Harriet, Ida, Fannie Lou, Sojourner, Maya, and the slaves. I'm from one power and one love that operate daily in my life. This poem was written over 20 years ago, and it's one that I have used many times in my classes and in the various nonprofit organizations in which I've worked. I've used it as an assignment, always a teacher. This is a reflective poetry, which is part of what George L. Lyons has introduced to many in writing workshops about cultivating a way in which you can talk about the cultural identity and racial identity of those you work with, live with, those you teach, those you serve. So I gift you with this piece, and I thank you because it was tucked away. And I thought this would be a great time to share this piece because it's just not about me. It's a tool for you. It's a way you could think about how you could engage in racial learning in a variety of different ways and have a conversation about your racial identity, about racism, and your experiences with racism. So let's start. And I want to say throughout my presentation, you will see images that may be triggering. There may even be language use and concepts that also may be disturbing to you as well as triggering. So I want to give you this warning. And again, I support what Brenda laid out to you is to take care of yourself. Self-care is so much a part of our preservation. And it is indeed foundational for us to do the real hard work of becoming an anti-racist. So let's start with our objectives for the short time that I'm with you. We have 4 objectives. I have 4 objectives, and I want to say that it's the beginning of unpacking these objectives with the intent of engaging in race-based learning today, to be able to review some race-based terminology that would allow us to examine ways to be anti-racist. And finally, to explore opportunities and ways and skills that you can incorporate in your own anti-racist practice, and where these types of skills and strategies can transcend and translate into your own workplace. So I always like to do some level setting and make sure we're on the same page. And if you were in my classroom, we would have constructed these together. But the hope is to let you know the spirit and the essence in which I come to you. And from the work that I've done, I always think it's important to lay out at least my assumptions at this point, where this is a session where the content is applicable to anyone, regardless of your positionality, your identity. It's a session that will share specific skills and strategies and tools for developing an anti-racist practice. It's an opportunity for us to listen, particularly listen to the experiences of others that you will hear over the 2 days of this conference. Here, we want to consider how anti-racism can work in the environments in which we work and live. And finally, I always see this work from a novice mindset. This is the beginning. We have so much to learn. I am still learning. I constantly put myself in the seat of the student. This session is designed to be a conversation, although we're not in the same room. You will have, I would hope, opportunities to think about ways in which you can continue the conversation about what you're being exposed to, not only in this session, but in the conference, in your work environment, and in your own professional learning. So I'd like to start with a self-awareness poll, and I believe somebody's gonna help pull that up. And we'll see if the technology gods are working with us. I can't see the poll. Could someone let me know if it's up? Yes. So take a few moments. I don't see it, but I'm hoping you can see it, and select one statement that best describes how you feel. And just your first reaction. And I'm hoping to have 100% participation. This is just the kind of educator I am, wanting to engage you, even though I can't see you. A few more seconds. You're only selecting one. Laura, can you see what the response rate is?
Yes, we have 81%, 83%. So we're getting there.
Okay, we're getting there. No pressure. Okay, let's close the poll and let's see the results. Okay. So I'm not sure if everyone could view the results, but I'm going to share with you what the majority of the participants have posted. That they usually are comfortable talking about race and racism. And we do have people in the room who are very uncomfortable about talking about race and racism. And some who would prefer not to talk about it at all. And I think that the results of the poll, and we can close it now, is one that tells us a lot of different things. It gives us a lot of different insight. And I would say, depending on sometimes the day, your experiences, what you've heard, how you've been influenced by social media and any other forms of media and conversations, that your response to this poll could be different. But it is, again, another example of a poll, a tool, a strategy, a way to connect with those that you are working with, and places where you operate, places where you lead, to start to get a sense of how people are feeling about this topic of race and racism, which is so much part of who we are as people in this particular society, in this particular racialized country. One thing when you're doing work that's relating to race and racism, it's helpful to really explore the kind of definitions we are working with. And the definitions that I want to start you out with, and I would say with any of these concepts, you will be able to, on your own, sort of, and given the experience of those who are in the room, sort of have your own way of talking about these concepts. And also some of us may be constantly expanding our language and the ways in which we represent our understanding of these concepts. But racism, as I have come to understand it and know it, it's about prejudice, it's about discrimination, it's about antagonism that's directed to a person or a group of people just because of the membership of their racial identity. And it's typically someone that is marginalized or in a minority group. Systemic racism happens at the systems level, in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representation, and other norms work in various ways, often reinforcing and perpetuating racial group inequities. And quite often, I ask myself, what are the norms that are holding racism in place? And it's a question that you may want to think about. Again, throughout this session, I want to say have your virtual notepad or your old school notepad nearby so you can take some notes and really reflect on what you're thinking. It's not about agreeing with everything that I'm presenting to you today. It's about perspective. And it's about seeing where those areas where you may feel uncomfortable and where are the areas that you are now opening up and starting to understand a new way of thinking, a new mindset, a growth mindset. So racial equity, when we are looking at this particular term, we're looking at the social, economic, and political opportunities and outcomes that aren't based on a person's race. We're moving to advancing racial equity. We're moving towards disrupting what racism has done. Anti-racism is the practice of actively identifying and opposing racism. The frame that I'd like for us to use for our work today, and I bring to your attention the work of Joe Fegan, a sociologist. His book, The White Racial Frame, Centuries of Racial Framing and Counterframing, is one of my foundational pieces. One thing about the racial white frame or the white racial frame, it really helps us understand how the system of oppression, which we've all experienced, operates. And it includes not only stereotyping and bigotry and racist ideology, but it also includes visual images, an array of emotions and sounds of accented language that interconnects in narratives that end up sort of leaning, and not just leaning, but connecting to the pathway to giving people grounds to discriminate. And these frames, this white racial frame, is operating in our everyday operation. This is the dominant frame that shapes our thinking and actions in everyday situations. And so it's, this frame becomes a way in which you can think about the subconscious and the conscious dimension of racism and how it looks and sometimes how it operates through policies and practices, but also the behavior and the attitudes of individuals that we find ourselves interacting with. So when you take on this racial white frame, it reconnects you to what does racism, white supremacy, and racial prejudice sort of mean? How do they interconnect? Well, they're supported by racial stereotyping and implicit biases that permeate our culture. And, when you think about racism and how it manifests itself in our society, it's not limited to individuals who are just in hate groups. This is activated by individuals and groups in a variety of settings that may not see themselves as hate groups, but they are causing harm. And when we think about racism, white supremacy, and racial prejudice, we're also thinking about the feelings and the beliefs and the assumptions that result in marginalized people. People have a justification of why they are excluding members from particular racial groups. And the onus has been on us to sort of prove that racism exists. So when you look at these particular images, I want you to think for a moment, what do they say to you? And it was in 2020 where we suddenly realized that we were experiencing two pandemics, not just COVID-19, but when we saw George Floyd killed before our very eyes, and we saw around the country where there was an outpouring, a demand for racial justice, we realized the insidious dimension of racism and that racism is also a pandemic. When we look at disparities across racial groups, particularly Black and white, we have come to understand that racism is also a public health crisis. And so when you look at these images, there is also representation of a very diversive or divisive view of what diversity can do for us. So you see here in the picture, when diversity wins, we all lose. That connects to the premise of the zero-sum game. If I give anything, an opportunity, a job, or if someone gets a job, an opportunity of any sort, that I lose. Not understanding the historical racism that has been embedded in the fabric of our society, where people of color, BIPOC people, have been losing all their lives from the day they were born. So again, imagery is powerful, and also it helps us have conversations, and conversations about what they tell you, what's your opinion. And so again, wanting you to use this as an example of how you can use images in your own work to start the conversation. So when we look at this particular image, excuse me for a minute, I'm gonna have to stay in this mode. Something's not cooperating, but that's okay. I've been working online for a long time, so these things happen. So our history of slavery is one that really speaks to how human beings treated other human beings. And the brutality of slavery cannot be denied. So our history of slavery speaks to what racial oppression does to us. It's traumatic. It's a traumatic form of interpersonal violence. And I love these words from Kenneth Hardy, that can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. It causes harm. The gentleman that you are looking at, his name is Gordon. And for many of us, I know for many years, I've seen this and I didn't know who he was. But I know this is Gordon. Sometimes this picture is referred to as the Whip Peter. He was an escaped American slave who became known as the subject of photographs documenting the extensive keloid scarring on his back from whipping that he received in slavery. Again, what is your reaction when you see this? What are the emotions that come up? Angry, fearful, these images provoke emotion. And this emotion starts to connect to our understanding of racial trauma and its residual effects and how it impacts everyone. So when we move beyond what we know has happened during slavery, we move into several decades later and look at how racial segregation was operationalized in this country. We were separate, but we were not, and we definitely wasn't treated equally. So this is an example of how my people was treated. And again, depending on where you grew up, this may resonate with you. My father, who grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, would talk about the separate bathrooms that he had to attend to, as well as what was available for us. It was always less than. And this is how they treated us, less than human. So racial segregation, as we have come to know it, for many can amount to the international crime of apartheid. It's a crime against humanity. And these are examples, again, of what racism looks like. When we take it a step further of what racism looks like and what it looks like at the individual, interpersonal, and institution, as well as systemic level, it permeates all sectors, all environments that we operate in, whether it's public health, the criminal justice system, housing, banking, education, Department of Children and Family Services, departments of welfare, social welfare, departments of human resources, and the list goes on. At the individual level, there's a race-based belief and feeling within individuals about why people are getting services or why they shouldn't get services. And that is connected quite often with bigotry and biases that gets translated into our policies and our practices. So we have seen and come to understand that discriminatory policies and practices do exist, and they exist in organizations and institutions. And for those who are attending is to step back for a moment and see where you have come to understand how these operate in organizations and institutions that you're familiar with. And for some, maybe you say you haven't seen it, but can you listen to the experiences of others with the hope of trying to understand how systemic racism is organized and curated, and it's ongoing. And ongoing racial inequities maintain our society, which is built around that racial frame, that white racial frame that I exposed you to a few minutes ago. So when we think about how do racial inequalities, sort of look, and where's the evidence of it? Well, the fact that in this country, we could say that we have created a school to prison pipeline, that from elementary school, we have already regulated individuals, children, babies, that their pathway will be straight to the prison line by the decisions we make for them, by relegating them to special ed and not monitoring their progress. When we think about mass incarceration, we in this country imprison more people than any other country. When we come to understand why the communities that you live in, think about it for a moment. Who's your neighbor? Who comes to your home? Who are you friends with? Segregation was planned. And racial profiling is also a part of our way of extending racial bias into our community, our practices, and creating an environment that eliminates opportunities for people or regulate or directs them to a path of being in the prison system. I'm not going to go through all of these, and there's probably others to add, but I want you to just look at them and to look at the image in this cartoon to says, you know, there's so many barriers that are put in the way of people of color that makes it almost insurmountable to get to the finish line. But we know with the perseverance of people of color, they have gotten through the finish line without help. But the point is there's so many barriers in the way. So solutions to social justice and racial inequality, one would say just stop racism. We have to have a family of solutions to speak to the insidious dimensions, the curated dimensions of racism. We need anti-racist advocates that's actively, continuously confronting and challenging racism. So some of you may be familiar with this visual, and this particular piece helps us think about at an individual level, what do we have to do? So I'm going to be the first to say, to become an anti-racist is not a formula. It's, you know, it's not a linear if then if you do this thing and then this thing and then voila, you will become an anti-racism or racist, I should say. You may find moments where you will have aspects of your being, your way of interacting, the decisions that you make, that you are in that fear zone, that you're not feeling comfortable about the situation, the dynamics, and you find it very, very difficult to sort of have a conversation about how racism exists in your particular environment. And I'm using the word environment broadly. But that fear is real. It connects to emotion, it connects to your history, your experiences. And I invite you to sort of look within and look at where are you on the spectrum and how do you traverse it? Under what conditions do you go through the learning zone, which you are in right now by being in this session, where you're looking at ways in which to educate yourself about race and structural racism. And you do it not only in this kind of session, but you do it on your own by what you read, what you listen to, what you look at, and that you move towards this continuous growth zone where you are advocating, you are speaking out, you are being able to own up to your mistakes. And at the same time, be able to promote and advocate policies and leaders who are anti-racist. It is a process. And it's a process, again, that we traverse through this work at the individual level in many different ways. On any given day, you could be in a different zone. So the work has started, it continues. So when you think of anti-racism at the collective and organizational levels, as I've been saying, it's active, it's ongoing. And it's about identifying and strategically thinking about ways to eliminate racism by changing systems and the way systems work, and always sort of thinking about who benefits from this system and who's harmed by the system. Think about organizational structures. What do they look like? Who benefits from that and who's harmed? What are the policies and practices in place? So part of your work is constantly examining policies and practices in place and asking why? Why? And who benefits and who's harmed? Who benefits and who loses? Who's at the table actually designing those policies and practices? And another piece, the human being piece, the human behavior piece, is about how you personally, because I think it's at the personal level, how do you go about changing your attitude and your behavior? And this will allow a redistribution of power and opportunities, and that we can start to move towards an equity mindset and an equitable way of actually doing our work, distributing resources and opportunities to people. I know that there's a Q&A box, and so I know I've been going for a while, and I want to give people an opportunity to post questions. Brenda, could you let me know how I'm doing on time?
You have
Yes,
15 minutes.
Oh, this is great. So when we think about anti-racism and what it means, it does several things for us. And this is, I would say, a truncated list, and you probably have your own list, or you can add to this list. So it's thinking about how does it help us understand and recognize racism? This is a benefit. This is an opportunity that we have through the work of Ibram Kendi and others who are being transparent in helping us sort of create space for us to dialogue about racism. So the benefits of anti-racism, it works, it helps us work towards ending racial oppression and all forms of oppression, not just racism, but classism and sexism. Anti-racism helps us focus on the racial healing that is needed. And how do we start to advance racial equity? Who is making the decision? It's interesting to look now after the killing of George Floyd, we were hearing it's time for racial reckoning. We were hearing conversations about reparations were coming back to life. And we were hearing corporations and organizations and foundations, they were pouring in millions of dollars to advance racial equity. The question that comes up for me is how we're doing. What are we doing? Do we still have the same fervor? Are we still moving with all deliberate speed to end racism? So these are things that I'm curious about, and think about the things that you're curious about. And again, what are the benefits of anti-racism? Anti-racism provides us a pathway to unlearn the misinformation about the history of enslavement and discrimination towards people of color. Depending on when you were born, where you went to school, where you grew up, your family's values, your family's sense of history, all of that has penetrated into our ways of knowing and thinking. So now we have a new channel. And this new channel of anti-racism helps us also develop empathy. And I think in, given the field of social work and the code of ethics, which we all are familiar with, it's constantly thinking about how do you operationalize them? Where do they show up? Do you have empathy about this particular topic and why? So think about what you could add to this list. So when you put everything that you've heard so far in perspective, I know I have a sense of urgency. It's like, what can I do? First and foremost, and started this off, and Brenda mentioned it and I mentioned it, this thing called self-care, which I know I've been around enough social workers, change agents, practitioners, clinicians, social work educators. And it's like, yep, I know it, but I don't practice it. And it's so important that we have this mind, body, soul balance, this sense of mindfulness, this centering, so that we can do this work. This work will just wear on you. This work has its level of, it can make you raw because you want to see change and you want to see it quickly. And again, I can look 20, 30 years and say, a lot of things haven't changed. But for yourself is setting the intention on what you will do. Where will you enter into this space? How will you recognize and interrogate your own emotions around race and racism? And here it comes again, develop empathy. And I know being a change agent always sounds like something noble, and it's something that we all want to do, though. We want to get behind it. How can you be an advocate for change? Think about what you would prioritize. What's the strategic priorities that you will have around doing this work? How will you continue to educate yourself and unlearn the stereotypical knowledge that we all have about race and racism? And it is about taking action, but you can't do it alone. It's about collaborating with others to challenge racist policies in practice and demonstrate progress on racial equity. It's think about how you will really be intentional in understanding what you're doing, why you're doing, and how you know that you have achieved it. So, and finally, when you think about action steps, it's creating the space to dialogue about solutions. And all of this is continuous. It doesn't stop, and you can probably add many more steps to this. So the call to action is, first and foremost, is sort of centering and understanding that racism is alive and well in America. And we are on the path of doing something, but it's an upward climb. So we're just getting started. And here's a moment to ask yourself, are you going to be the person who figures out what policies and practices are causing inequities? And that's everywhere in the service delivery system you're part of, or you're designing, or you're managing, your classroom, your workplace, your community. Are you going to be the person to advocate for change? And specifically thinking about what you can do as social workers, educators, clinicians, leaders, colleagues, mentors, and peers. What can you do? What will you do? And as John Lewis reminds us all, it's about getting into good trouble, right? So take a few moments, and not just now, but throughout the conference, and think about what's the hard part of talking about race and racism? What's the beneficial part about talking about race and racism? How do you benefit? How do other people benefit? So from my perspective, and after all the years that I've been doing this work, I always come back to the basics. It's about listening, learning, and advocating, and finding the place where you can activate your voice. So anti-racism is a practice of freedom. And from the time I stepped foot in academia over 20 years ago, I was anchored in the work of bell hooks. And she reminds us in the way that only bell hooks can remind us, is that the moment we choose to love, we move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move toward freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. Thank you, bell hooks, because those words still anchor me in my practice of freedom. So I leave you with this last image, reminding us that racism is a pandemic and the work continues. It's our marathon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maddox. That was very inspiring and powerful. So I have one question for you. This is a little bit long. I often meet and have worked for leaders that are firmly opposed to affirmative action because they believe it's reverse racism. Some people do not want policies to change because it will threaten their power and position. They don't want a BIPOC person like me to take a position they feel entitled to. How do we help others understand the difference between equality versus equity and the need for public policies such as affirmative action and when these policies do not affect or benefit them?
Well, that would require a whole nother lecture.
Yeah.
But and good to see you, Debbie.
Perfect.
I just want to break out of presenters mode. Thank you.
Nice to see you.
I see that question in a variety of different ways. And it goes back to how I started out this presentation, is stepping back and being able to define what equality and equity is. And again, this is not a solo act. This is, again, creating listening circles, dialogue circles, and spaces is a way to begin the conversation for people to understand the experiences that that particular person is having in their environment and others. So part of it is, again, at the individual level, needing space to talk about your reality and the inequities that you see, how you feel like you're passed over, you're not mentored, there is no connection to opportunities, but other people seem to have access to them, as an example. The other thing is you have to think about the ways in which you want to facilitate change in that particular organization or environment. Data is your friend. It cannot be denied. And I would say data comes in two forms, qualitative and quantitative. So hearing the stories of people who can repeatedly talk about how they're treated helps those stories come to life, where people understand a reality that could be invisible quite often. The other dimension, when you talk about wanting to change policies and practices, we tend to talk in a very general way, but you have to sit back and understand what policies and practices are we talking about, and why do we need to change them, and what are they going to be changed to, so that there can be fairness and equity above everything else. We're talking about justice. We're talking about what's fair and what's right. And that should be part of our practice. That should be part of our culture. That should be our mission. So again, sometimes it's even going back to the mission statement and say, are we in alignment here with our mission? Also, we're of an era of commitment statements that people are writing. They're wonderful, beautiful, well-crafted statements. And you have to say, and what are we doing? So reading a commitment statement void of having action that represents your commitment is just an acknowledgement that you want to demonstrate verbally that you have a commitment statement. So there's so many things that that question raised for me that I believe, I could unpack it in so many different dimensions, but I hope I at least started to answer the question.
Yeah, thank you. Now everybody's interested in the slides, and they are in the materials section of the dashboard, so they can be downloaded. So Thank you for sharing your material. And somebody also wants to know if it's possible to get a written copy of your reflective poem. They would love to invite some of their clients to write their own reflective poems.
Okay, I haven't put it out there, but I guess I can do that. For sure, I'll get it to Brenda. And the slides, a few of them, I made some adjustment, up to the minute you're adjusting your slides. So you'll see the essence of what I did. Mostly it's intact, but I did make some changes. Just wanted to let you know that. And again, when I was thinking about what to present to you, I was hoping you can see various strategies that you can employ in your environment, no matter what your role is. Whether you're a manager, whether you're a supervisor, whether you're frontline folk, seeing that there's hopefully something there that you can take away.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was so inspiring and just laid the foundation that we needed. So I appreciate you. And on behalf of the audience, I thank you so much for spending this time and sharing your wisdom with us.
You are so welcome. I'm grateful. It is, again, an honor to be in this space with you. And I'm wishing you, the council, and everyone who's participating a wonderful, productive time at the conference. May you continue to learn. And because I'm in the USC sort of family, these days we say fight on together. So,
I like that. Okay.
bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
So we are going to move on now. We have a full slate of presentations, and I'm excited to share with you what's happening next. So what we have actually at this point is a wonderful expert panel of presenters from Children's Hospital of Los Angeles to share about their experience of working on organizational change around racism within a behavioral healthcare setting. The panel is being facilitated by Carrie, a longtime member of the Social Work Women's Council and a licensed clinical social worker for over 20 years at the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine, who provides treatment, program development, and leadership activities on behalf of clinical services to youth and young adults with a high degree of clinical complexity. She's being joined by Dr. Bridgid Conn, a child and adolescent psychologist specializing in treatment of gender diverse youth and those with complex trauma, and Nancy Hernández, a licensed clinical social worker providing trauma-informed care for alcohol and other drug users, offering culturally sensitive services in both Spanish and English, and very passionate about working on immigrant rights. So now I'll turn it over to our panel.
Carrie, I think I have to unmute.
Thank you. So we're really excited to be here. We're involved in a division-wide effort to transform our Division of Adolescent Medicine at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And I'm a little nervous, so I have to get myself grounded here. Okay. So we want to start by introducing ourselves with our own social location, our intentionality for this presentation today. So I'll start with me. My name is Carrie Mounier. I'm a LCSW at Children's Hospital. I've been there for 22 years. And as far as my social location, I'm white. I don't solidly identify with any particular cultural background. My grandparents' families came from 4 different backgrounds: Mexico, Ireland, Italy, and Holland. And when I was growing up, for the most part, I would say that I had awareness of injustice and oppression, but it was primarily related to injustice and oppression of children and women. I had awareness of oppression of people who were gay or lesbian. And for sure, I was aware of oppression related to poverty. But I wasn't really attuned to the intersecting aspect of race and racism until after I got out of high school, and it's sort of like my social world changed. And I consider myself passionate and committed to anti-racism. And at the same time, I know I'm a learner and I don't see or recognize everything.
Nancy, would you like to?
Sure. My name is Nancy Hernández, she, her, ella, and I am from Los Angeles, native South LA. My positionality is that I'm a clinical social worker. I am Latina. I am of Salvadoran descent, and I was always very aware of my race, even within the Latinx community, because I'm a minority within it, in that I am not Mexican, and often there was a lot of discrimination for Central American immigrants in my community. I think I was aware of injustices growing up because of poverty, because of having special need family members, because of immigration issues and police brutality issues in my own community. I remember I was in the heart of when the Rodney King riots happened. I remember the police going down my block, being an elementary student, having to duck because there was a drive-by at the school. So I was always very aware of the need for safety, and also how those providing safety were tricky people, didn't always trust them. So it was just like these weird relationships that we had with authority. And that's kind of what led me into social work. Thank you.
Thanks. So my name is Bridgid Conn. My pronouns are she, her. And I would say I identify through that lens of intersectionality that has been talked about this morning as a multiracial Japanese American with roots in the colonized lands of Hawaii. And so growing up there, definitely surrounded by the rich, beautiful culture of the Hawaiian people, and understanding, really like the history of colonization within those lands and how that really has shaped the experiences of the Native people there, and myself and others having been transplanted there, and really trying to honor, with the traditions and rituals of trying to honor the lands and the indigenous people of Hawaii. I also grew up really having through that lens of understanding socioeconomic disparities, because there are definitely huge social class gaps as well, in the islands, and really having that understanding of how wealth and access to education really shaped the lives of young people, which is what led me to actually going towards psychology and understanding mental health for young people who really didn't have access, being historically oppressed and having resources taken from them and distributed elsewhere. So that has really shaped, I think, all of my career into really trying to understand how do we take to task the systems, especially like medical systems, that disproportionately provide different care to some groups rather than others who have historically held more power and privilege, particularly in our country. So I think our intentionality and my intentionality in having this conversation today is how do we really, at this point of where we are, try and focus particularly around anti-racism within an academic medical setting.
And we just want to kind of acknowledge that we're not speaking for everybody. Every person's journey is different. We don't see ourselves as experts. We see ourselves as like on the journey. We're trying to be part of a collective process, but we're not anywhere near the end of that process. So how we're going to proceed today is with a series of questions about our experience in this process. And we're hoping that through this, that other people will have the opportunity to think about how could some of these ideas be discussed in your organization. And I want to acknowledge having like a vague sense of unease about talking about efforts of anti-racism in an organization when you're still working in it. I guess for my positionality, I've been there for 22 years. I've been in multiple programs, and I wouldn't be there if I didn't appreciate the work that they were doing. I think that their intentions in pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism are sincere. And I have found the process interesting and meaningful. But I could see how different people with different intersectional identities might not even be comfortable having this conversation at all. So just want to bring our attention to the NASW Code of Ethics. So part of our Code of Ethics is a standard that social workers work to understand, combat, and prevent interpersonal and structural racism and oppression and other forms of oppression within micro, meso, and macro levels of practice. So this is something that we are all supposed to be doing and pursuing, regardless of what our role is, regardless of what our setting is. So the first question for our group is, what was your experience of diversity, equity, and inclusion concerns in our workplace before and after 2020?
I think some of us had that experience of a lot of the BIPOC employees that they've been screaming this and they've been sharing this information, they've been feeling this and going through this before it came to light. It wasn't something new. It wasn't something that was like flashy. It was something like we've been saying, we've been yelling it. Thank you for finally hearing it. And at the same time, what the heck? Why weren't you listening before? I'm tired of screaming. I'm tired of having said all of this.
And I would say that we've always talked about intersectionality and racism and oppression in relation to the young people that we serve, but that I didn't experience us talking about those issues for everyone, both staff and young people, and how the oppression of one group influences the oppression of both groups. So I felt like we always thought about the importance of providing equitable care to our clients, but I don't think that we had that experience of like reflecting and looking inward more so until after 2020.
And it made us a little more comfortable and like even we knew how to advocate for our clients and we knew how to like check systems, but it made us a little more confident and made us see the importance of even checking our coworkers and like calling in when our coworkers and our team members or even other people, administration in the hospital weren't doing the work or were maybe just talking about it, but not actually following through. You know, sometimes when you're at the main hospital, things are operated differently than they are in behavioral health or mental health or substance use, because it's like through the medical need and people think that it's very objective, that it's very standard in care, but your biases carry over even in medicine. And you can see it in the way that certain people are given priority or the way we interpret why a patient didn't adhere to medication or the way that a patient had responded to a clinician's advice or a clinician's comment.
So the division has taken on a pretty big DEI initiative, and it has had multiple components to it. We've been in, so we always had guiding principles, but in 2020, we realized that they were largely colorblind. And so that's really, really bad. So we were like, okay, we need to stop, we need to reflect, we need to more clearly articulate our guiding principles. And we'll share a little bit more about that process in a bit. We also went through each individual program in our division, did internal self-evaluation and goal setting. Then each individual program had, like they called them build and grow 360 program reviews, where we presented our evaluation and our goals, and we got feedback from people in other programs as well as like hired consultants. We've had training opportunities for anti-racism. There's been several structured opportunities for employees to share their experiences and provide feedback. And then there's been some like task-specific ad hoc groups that are ongoing, working on specific issues. And, we'll talk more about that too. At least one of the groups that I'm in had a book club. And then there's intention, I don't know if it exists yet, but there's intention to have a data dashboard and progress through that. So I'm interested in hearing from Dr. Conn and from Nancy about what aspects that you participated in, and kind of what was your experience and how did you feel about it?
I can start. So I currently serve in our division as one of the co-chairs for the anti-racism committee. And I know this is kind of one of the discussion points that will come up later, is sort of decision making around, for those of us who have different lived experiences that are particularly sort of came up and feeling like we're doing a lot of work, putting in a lot of effort. Making these decisions is really challenging, right? Where do you put your time and your energy to, on top of all of the other expectations that we have, on top of being clinicians and trying to hold the collective trauma of multiple pandemics occurring at the same time for the young people that we work with and our colleagues who are living through these multiple pandemics and experiencing a lot of trauma at the same time. So we know that we all have, as human beings, bandwidth, right, of what we spend our energy towards. So one of the things I had to make sort of a conscious decision around was like what I wanted to be engaged in. So the anti-racism ad hoc group is one of the things that I participate in, but part of the communication around that with leadership was like, this isn't going to be a 6-month endeavor. This isn't even going to be a 1-year endeavor. Like, we need to have a collective agreement that this is going to be a priority ongoing. And when when I step down, when my time is over, that there will be someone else who kind of steps into that place, and that this is not like a 1 year, like, oh, this is happening right now and we think it's important right now and then it's going to go away. It was a very intentional conversation about how do we keep this particular focus, even if other committees are sort of short-lived or attending to a particular issue that's happening. We decided as a group that we wanted to put our time and energy into this committee that focuses on prioritizing education and training for staff, in terms of engaging with each other as colleagues, engaging with our communities that we work with, and then the dashboard where we're collaborating with the hospital to gather information, not only about our staff, but trying to understand who are we serving, and are there communities that are underrepresented in our particular programs that we can have more intentionality around outreach and engagement.
Sorry, my camera's off. I'm on the field today and I'm trying to find the place to still be here. But one of the things that I was part of was the 360 review of the programs. And I was part of reviewing and preparing our program to be reviewed. And I was also in part of other programs that were reviewed. And what was nice was that the consultants that were from outside sent over a link of questions, a list of questions that we had to answer, that we had to address. So it was someone that really made us question ourselves and challenge ourselves, because there were questions that we couldn't lie about, or that we couldn't make ourselves look more favorable. Like, it made us really accountable to these things. And then being part of seeing other people's equity reviews or 360 reviews, it was interesting to see where their growth could happen and where their growth was happening, and how you could transfer those skills out to our other programs, like for our program, or how how maybe they didn't see how certain things could be racist or how certain things were limiting. For instance, a lot of the comments that we got were that, well, we can't do that with that group because our funding is not in that area, or the service area that we work for is mostly Latine, so we can't really focus on the Black youth. But we kept questioning, like, Black youth exist everywhere. Why are we not increasing our efforts to pull out, even if it's just 0.05% of SPA 4, and I totally made that number up. Even if it's like certain percent of SPA 4, why aren't we working harder to engage them? Why are we just falling back on, well, they're not the majority? So even questioning our own programs, our co-workers in a constructive way, and them being open to that was really, really helpful in building stronger programs, building stronger connections, and even thinking outside the box.
And in the process, we saw different programs sort of showing more intention, and some programs sort of like being like, there's not a lot we can do. Some programs focusing on like, we can and we need to do more, and other programs sort of falling back on the like, well, we're just a little program and it all depends on the hospital. And so like sort of falling back on that larger structural system of how can we do something if they're not doing more. One thing that was sort of is interesting is that like nobody has been hired on our staff to like work on in the division on this full time. So like, yes, Children's Hospital has a DEI person, but the hospital is much bigger than adolescent medicine. Adolescent medicine is probably 8 programs that are employing maybe 100, maybe 115 people. And so within adolescent medicine, nobody's hired to do this work. Everybody is participating voluntarily, and everybody is doing it on top of whatever their normal workforce is. We need sponsorship from our leadership, but it's not driven by the leadership. It's a bit more collaborative than that. So what would you say, Bridgid and Nancy, what have been some of the challenges during this process, as well as what are some of the things that you feel like actually are moving forward?
I think that what stood out to me the most was that as a clinician, I still had to meet my productivity. So there was this big push on Black and Brown and BIPOC providers to speak up and let us know how you're feeling and do these things, and let us know, first of all, we're putting the burden on the providers that are experiencing the trauma to come and tell you, this is my trauma, and also this is what you gotta do to fix it. Like, it's extra emotional labor, it's extra psychological labor on the BIPOC providers. And on top of that, you still have to meet your productivity, because at the end of the day, we are community mental health. That's where capitalism comes into play, where it's like, we appreciate this, but we also have to pay these bills, because that's the reality of community mental health. The Children's Hospital is a nonprofit, so they still have to meet certain requirements, and that's taxing on someone to want to emotionally open up how this is exhausting, because as a BIPOC provider, this is not the first time you're encountering this. You've been encountering this your entire life. And then you're reliving it with your own clients who are bringing up their stories, who might even be triggering for your own self and for your own experiences, and hearing their trauma, like, that vicarious trauma that's occurring as well. And then saying the solutions, give me the solutions on how to fix it, because you're the expert. And then still make sure that all your stuff is in on time and you're meeting those requirements. It was extremely taxing and exhausting.
I would say one sort of difference, having been, I think, over the past couple of years on different sort of task forces or in different meetings where DEI initiatives have been brought up or starting to be spearheaded. I would say since we started the specific anti-racism committee, which is not solely focused or driven by leadership or folks who are like managers or faculty, but really is an effort to be collaborative with staff. So staff are invited, and and are a central part of all decision making, that we've really, I think, all come together to identify what are our priority areas, and going back to the leadership and saying, you know, these are the things that we want to work on. This is where we want to put our energy and efforts towards sort of prioritizing collaboratively as a group, rather than it feeling very sort of like top heavy in terms of who's making those decisions, and not being reflective of perhaps what all staff or the staff who are there are wanting. In terms of the question, I saw that popped up, which I think I can speak to as well. So not just at CHLA, what I've been hearing is sort of at, you know, a lot of academic institutions and medical institutions, right? There's been this surge in hiring of DEI folks, and it looks like, and it feels like there's a lot more money sort of being directed to creating things like dashboards, making sure that our medical systems are reflective of, and we're able to document people's intersecting identities correctly, right? And that takes money, and that takes energy, or somebody dedicated to be able to change those systems. I could say for ourselves, in terms of funding opportunities, you know, we sort of put together proposals or have ideas for even sort of seed grants, because we were provided like a budget, and the staff were able to generate ideas. What would we do if we had just this sort of amount of money just earmarked for the anti-racism group? And actually, when we came up with a consultant who recently did a training for us, and will be working with a cohort of thought leaders within our division and training around addressing racial and ethnic microaggressions in the workplace, that person like sort of went beyond the budget that we were initially given, and the leadership were really, I think, eager and open to working with us around making sure that we're even, you know, making sure that we're paying our consultants, you know, what they deserve, and for their expertise. So I think having folks kind of at the table who are saying like, this is really important to all of us, and this is where we would like to sort of divert these resources that we have, and being very open and transparent and talking about money, which makes a lot of folks uncomfortable. It was something that we could do to really push that conversation forward and make sure that what staff wanted was prioritized.
And just acknowledging that we're Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and we get grants, like people want, or programs, they want to fund us. So we have opportunities for obtaining monies that like smaller nonprofits probably wouldn't have. Some of the additional sort of challenges in this process is like, everything is more work. So like, you want to do data collection, but that means everybody has to submit more data. And then there's people that have to run the data and put it into reports. And like, so there's those kinds of things where it's like, we're already doing so much. Another thing is about kind of what Nancy was saying, is that in a lot of our efforts, like, we didn't feel like there was enough BIPOC and especially Black representation in the different activities that we were doing. And like, we respect it, but we really wanted more. And so, you know, like, everything is voluntary, but that was one of the challenges that we had. And then things that are structural, like the medical model itself, or specific grant requirements that sort of really restrict the way that you're supposed to do things. Those were hard. I'm going to move on to the next question I'm sorry, I'm going to go on to, there we go. So we put our guiding principles into the event materials, so you can look at them more in depth. A group of probably 20 of us in the division met weekly for several months in 2020, because we realized that our guiding principles were not culturally responsive. And so so we took them and then we refined them and we wordsmithed them and we made them really articulate our vision of what we wanted the division to be. And we've embraced them. We also realized that they're really more for us. It's really more for us than they are for the young people that we serve. And that's okay, but we realize it's not really, like, this thing right here isn't very meaningful to the young people that we serve. It's more meaningful to us as the providers. So what do you see as the effects of capitalism and white supremacy in the work environment? And how does it affect hiring and retention of employees?
I could start. I think this is something that we talk about a lot because there's this tendency to shift towards, well, if we hire more employees that identify as Black or African American, that, you know, that's sort of the end all be all of the work, right? So like if we have a statement on our job postings that we are, you know, affirming of people's identities, we are an anti-racist organization, that's like where it lies. But what we really have come to, I think, try and reflect on and have more dialogue around is just this question: how are the practices or the patterns of trying to hire folks really reflective of capitalism and white supremacy in our settings? You know, this idea of, like, you know, when someone starts, like, they got to hit the ground running. There's you know, especially for staff, little to no sort of orientation or focusing on supporting someone and making that adjustment to the workplace. And really thinking about, okay, here's your productivity. You got to start, you know, seeing clients right away. And how do we, you know, thinking about really how do we support our BIPOC colleagues in the workplace as they're adjusting to a new work environment, and one that's sort of fraught right now, especially with sort of the recognition and impact of living through multiple pandemics in our current historical context. One of the things that we talk about a lot is not just about hiring, but really how do we create a work culture or environment or community that supports BIPOC colleagues, right? How do we really try to address the needs of what people are saying is going to help them feel more included, to feel like they have a sense of belonging, that they're represented, that they're supported and cared for. And I was speaking with Carrie and Nancy not too long ago about this. It's a recent piece that came out around factors that influence this, what people are talking about as the Great Resignation, right? And people are like, well, everyone just wants to work from home. It's, you know, no one wants to go into the workplace anymore. And what they're really realizing when they go in and start to ask folks about why they're leaving their workplaces, what is contributing to this, it really is feeling like there's a lack of inclusion and belonging and this a toxic work culture where they were, which led to the Great Resignation. It wasn't, you know, oh, I just prefer working from home. People were like, well, I'd go in if I felt like that was a healthy work environment for me, if I felt supported, if I felt that people actually valued me and the work that I do. So, you know, when we talk about, you know, not just the effects, but what are we going to do differently? It's really having these conversations about how do we invest in our staff and help them to feel like wherever they are, whether it's, you know, in a hospital like CHLA, in, you know, another community organization, in a nonprofit, how do we really try to dismantle the impact of white supremacy and capitalism in our work settings, while also recognizing that we are sort of beholden to these systems that really support us through funding, insurance, and things like that. And I think that comes through having transparency about that, but also developing these allyships and being able to sort of challenge or push back on some of those systems that are in place, and not saying like, well, that's the status quo and leave it as is.
When I think about how my experience with capitalism and service delivery, I think of how how capitalism makes it that we have to have a certain amount of production and spend the least amount possible. And that in turn results in hiring new clinicians, letting go of, excuse me, more experienced clinicians because you can't afford it. So what happens is that we end up losing very well experienced BIPOC clinicians and that are doing great work in the community because certain grants can't keep them. You know, it's ran by money, so we can't keep them. It's not productive for the program to keep someone that's a higher salaried. And then what ends up happening is that because we're community mental health, the communities we serve don't have access to these great experienced clinicians. The community we serve is kind of like an experiment group where, you know, new social workers or new therapists come and practice, but the ones that are really experienced are not supervising the new hires, or the ones that are extremely experienced are not providing services to the most needed, the most traumatized communities often because it's not affordable. You know, it's because we're driven by funds and money. So it's like another injury to Black and Brown and BIPOC communities and providers.
One of the things that we've done, and this sort of is in response to the question earlier about how do you argue the whole reverse racism argument, is that we've been talking about how cultural diversity is an area of expertise that everybody, all of us providers, all of our experiences are different. And all of these concepts, you might be able to relate intellectually, you might be able to relate empathically, or you might be able to actually identify with experiences of racial trauma. And it is like levels of depth, levels of expertise. And if you've experienced something, it doesn't mean that your experience was the same as everybody else's, but it does mean that you're going to see it and understand it in a different way. And so we've been arguing that like these areas of expertise, that it's not just reverse affirmative action, that it's an area of expertise and an area of competency that that people have. And it feels like that argument has been useful. So the next question is about how it affects our service environment. And I think we kind of already addressed that. Anything that you want to add about how the effects of capitalism are in the on the service delivery?
I think one thing that we've been reflecting on, you know, to kind of add to what Nancy has already shared, is really thinking about how this idea of timelines, right, for our clients, like how much time do they get in service, or if clients don't show up on time, or if they have, you know, myriad barriers to engaging in care. If they don't engage with us, we're like, well, I guess you don't get services, and they end up not being able to be in therapy. And I think that all of those kind of messages, the more that I've been engaged in the work and doing this work, the more that I realize that's indoctrination and internalization of the ideals of capitalism and white supremacy, right? Around, well, if you just cared more about the work, or if you valued my time, you would show up, rather than really centering our clients and their lived experiences and what's going on for them. And that goes in direct contrast, right, with the messages that we get about productivity and how many people we need to see. And if you don't see this client so many times, like, you need to, you know, put them back on the wait list or close their case. And what message does that send to us about like who we prioritize, and then who ends up getting access to care? And I think that like reflecting on that and understanding our role in perpetuating that, and how do we try to challenge those types of internalized timelines that constantly kind of get reinforced in our systems, I think is a really important part of really centering the needs of our clients, particularly in the communities that we serve.
Let's see, was that the next one? Yeah. So what are some of the ways that you think agency culture needs to change in order to become more anti-racist?
Oh, did we? Nancy? Oh, okay. Oh, she'll be able to jump back in. But so I can start then. So, I mean, this is a large overarching question, right? Because I think it, you know, there's where we are, you know, as a division, then there's where the hospital is, and I think this varies, right, for every agency, because folks are going to start kind of like in a different place as they really try to figure out what do we need, what does our agency need to really be engaging in anti-racist work. And I think, you know, where most folks start is around sort of like that education, reflection, having more conversations, and I think something that we really spend a lot of time on is understanding that the work is not going to be comfortable or easy. And there will be pushback. There will be people who say like, oh, we can't do that, or we've tried that before and it doesn't work. People aren't interested, or, you know, we had this event, no one showed up. Or, you know, or like, as Nancy was speaking to earlier, our contracts don't allow for that. And really trying to encourage more creativity and flexibility in the ways that we try to provide care, and understand that those ways of kind of adhering to protocols or guidelines have been you know, have been put into place for a particular reason, but part of our work is to kind of question that and understand that. I'm just sorry, I'm seeing the chat as well. Yes, absolutely. So trauma-informed care, like I think prior to 2020, there was like a sort of a whole series and a lot of training that we did within our division on trauma-informed care. And that's definitely a part of sort of orientation and ongoing training for folks, is the communities that we work, right, are historically and presently impacted by trauma and oppression. And these lived experiences and themes are woven throughout every conversation that we're having, you know, whether it's client-centered or client-focused engagement, or is it around staff and what we need in our training efforts, right? So 100%, I appreciate you highlighting that, because I think that that's something that sometimes we, it feels like we're sort of all speaking from that lens, in specifically in our division. So it feels like it's kind of in the background, but 100%, you can't do this work and focus on anti-racism without also, you know, thinking about and integrating trauma-informed perspectives and approaches.
One of the things I think about that needs to change is like that I feel like some of the norms are just like antithetical to people being okay. Like, I understand we don't want our contracts to fail, but you don't want people to get sick. And if the way that it's working is that in order for contract requirements to be fulfilled, people have to get sick and people have to break down, and that's just not okay. And so needing to be flexible, needing to like rethink things, needing to come up with different solutions than ones that we've had before. The answer can't be that you just have to work harder or longer. That's not okay. And so I feel like that is a conversation we need to have more often. And that's something we need to problem solve about. And it needs to be part of our agency culture change. Nancy, I see you're back. Is there anything you want to add for how the agency culture needs to change?
I'm okay for now. Thank you.
Okay. Whoops, sorry. So what are some of the ways that you've tried to move away from white supremacy in your clinical practice or in program development or research activities? And what skills have you needed to develop in order to become more well-versed and be more effective in this area?
I think one of the things that
I think the connection isn't good, Nancy.
uh,
I can't hear Nancy. Can you? Yeah.
and I apologize for my camera being off, but like I said, I'm on the field and the Wi-Fi is spotty here. One of the things that I worked on is like just bringing more culturally appropriate. Oh, I'll put it in the chat.
Well, Nancy puts it in the chat. How about you, Bridgid? What are some things that you've tried to do?
I think, I mean, this on so many levels, it's like really there's again, so much that we can talk about in terms of what this might look like in our different agencies, depending on the roles. I think in our clinical practice, something that we've shifted to is absolutely including, like we have sort of our formula for intakes. And one thing that we've started to include is talking more about and asking more about folks' intersecting identities, being very intentional about that, including in trauma. There's a trauma section around discrimination, racial trauma that they've experienced, and really doing a lot of training and highlighting that if folks feel uncomfortable asking these questions, if people don't think that it's as important or as necessary, or have any sort of like discomfort around asking these questions, doing training around like, or not even training, but providing sort of consultation or support around, okay, like why, what is leading to that discomfort? This is a really important part of the work that we're doing. And if it's not something that folks want to center or feel comfortable asking about, like understanding, why that is and helping them to be able to engage in those kinds of conversations with young people. I would definitely say, for myself as a researcher, really trying to sort of challenge and have intentional conversations with collaborators around who we're centering in our research activities. Like if folks are underrepresented or not the focus, like why not? Or if we feel like a particular community is not being, or their needs aren't being addressed, and really trying to, I think, hold true to sort of the real true community engaged or true community partnered research activities, and not just saying like, oh, I have a community advisory board, right? Or I spoke to this person and they looked at my interview and they said it was fine. But really, like, what does true community partnered research mean? And that, there's a really great, it's from the Greenlining Institute. Oh my gosh, I can send it to you all, and if you all want to distribute it, it's a really great policy report on addressing racism in research, but really talking about elevating folks in community as full partners in research, right? And that doesn't have to be sort of academic research. It can be anything that you're doing, having them as primary or principal investigators with you, co-investigating with you, having their input at every step of the way, especially, you know, when you're working with communities that you are not a member of as well, and acknowledging any of those, like, and doing the work for yourself, I think, around biases and ways that our own sort of limited lived experiences or lenses might be sort of limiting the impact of the research, particularly for the groups that we're trying to support the most, right, in addressing health disparities.
I know we're almost out of time and we need to go into Q&As, but one thing that I've learned is, like, I need to speak a different language to different people. Like, in order to move ideas forward in a meaningful way, I need to know how to say things. And it's sort of like having relationships in the room and sort of pressing like the right levers at the right time so that a series of people will say yes to something so that something can move forward. I have found the language of interdisciplinary practice and the language of structural competency to align really well with anti-racism. And those are both areas that people speak in medical settings. And so I have found that they go together well, and you can move things forward that way. But let's see, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I want to have some time to answer any questions that have come up.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your panel. It's very, very interesting. I really appreciate actually the work that you're putting together at Children's Hospital. You've answered a lot of the questions already. There are just a couple that you haven't answered throughout the presentation, but here's one. Since trauma can be associated with the effects of capitalism and racism and can then affect the engagement of patients and practitioners, do you think ACEs assessments may be helpful as a tool, not to erase the causes, but to be a tool towards change? And that's the adverse childhood experiences.
I'm mixed on that. I think it has potential, but I also think that the way it's delivered has the potential to be very re-traumatizing. And so I'm sort of not totally comfortable with just doing a routine checklist with everybody without having a meaningful plan for intervention. So I'm mixed on that, on the idea of doing the ACEs checklist with everybody.
I think one thing that we can do to incorporate structural change is, even when you're doing your assessments, when you're doing your intakes packets, incorporate those ACEs questions into it, so that it's set up in a way that you approach it lightly and with tactic, and in a way that you can provide that support, instead of just saying, here, open up these wounds that you have so I can give you a number and figure out how traumatized you are and how broken you are. Because that's how it lands. When people tell you these things, it lands of like, this is all that's wrong with you. This is all that happened to you. But if we start thinking about being more meaningful and more purposeful in our interventions, we can incorporate those things in there and kind of like, feed two birds with one pellet and get those answers that we need.
I would just add, like, I think that's a great question. And ACEs, you know, the original ACEs, right, are important and limited, because it doesn't really, I think, to your point, like, capture all of the effects of sort of capitalism and white supremacy. And so I've actually, like, in one study that I was working on, we modified the ACEs checklist to include what we knew in the particular community that we were working with were additional adverse childhood experiences that young people had told us about. And we wanted to really highlight that, like, the sort of like that initial study and the initial ACEs that's not even capturing all of the different adverse childhood experiences. And we need to really broaden our understanding and have folks asking different questions to really understand, you know, our clients as they're walking through the door. And I think it can be a really powerful tool really for helping a young person to think about, or anybody, right, to think about their mental health in the context of all of those experiences, not in, like, as Nancy was saying, like, what's wrong with me, but here are the things that I've lived through, what's happened in my life, you know, to where I am now.
And that's about, like Carrie was saying, the language. Like when we use, it's kind of like code switching. We have to approach it in a way that it doesn't, that it's like inviting and that it's seen as genuine, that I really want to figure out how we can move forward and heal for this, instead of just saying, I'm answering these questionnaires that I have to check off a list, or I'm trying to see how I can give you a solution because I'm the expert and you're not.
Okay. Okay, so there's one more question. How to clinically approach situations when the client has biases towards the clinician's color, race, or accent?
We're all quiet. So I guess we start with like acknowledging it internally so that we're not ignoring it, and we're not like reacting to it in an unconscious kind of way. And like seeking consultation in the sense that I'm talking to this parent and I'm pretty sure that they don't like me because of my identity. And I don't want to react, and I don't want to do something that's not clinically useful. So what would be helpful, and kind of getting that kind of feedback from your colleagues about how to proceed. That's kind of where I start.
I'm on the same boat. You know, I definitely acknowledge it. I'm a human and I'm triggered by this, especially as someone that has, you know, like we explained in the beginning who we are. We've gone through our own traumas and it triggers our own things, and it brings racism back onto us as providers. But even just walking to your coworkers saying like, hey, this is what happened. This is what is bringing up for me. This is how I'm feeling. Acknowledging that you could feel these things, that it's upsetting, that you don't want to deal with something like that, but you also don't want to abandon this patient. You don't want to abandon this human that you made a commitment to help. Finding your people who you can talk to, you can brainstorm, and you can even process and just vent and let out is very, very helpful in healing and having to move and moving forward with that. Some people say they address it. I think it really depends on the type of relationship you have with your patient. If you're able to build rapport, you can maybe bring it up later if it won't be of harm to them.
And sometimes we share cases, like, because it might be that you have a really good rapport with the youth, but the parents, like, there's an issue there, or vice versa. And so sometimes if you're working with a team, you can share the case to like at least spread it out, make it like not all focused on you as the provider.
What I think one thing I would add to that is you know, because I think you all have touched on, you know, in a lot of depth, holding that for ourselves and getting support around that. I think I also try to approach that with the client from a place of curiosity, like how they feel like this is going to impact care. Like if they're never going to trust me, or they're like, you can't understand my experiences, I want to understand that because I want to be able to provide the best care that I possibly can to them. But, you know, oftentimes when I've had that conversation, where it goes is like, you know, here's my training, here's my background. How do you think I might be able to help you? Do you think this is going to be a barrier for us? Do you think, you know, for a lot of the young people I work with, I'm like, we do a trial. Like, if you feel like it's not a good fit, or you feel like I am not the best clinician for you, you know, we can have that conversation, because folks do have the right to choose their therapist, right? Like, unless they're sort of in an involuntary situation. But I don't want them to feel like that's not their choice. But I do want to come at it from a place of like curiosity, and how, you know, taking sort of those things aside, how can I best help you? And how do you feel like that may or may not impact our ability to work together?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there's one more question. Well, what kind of data do you post on your data dashboard?
We can answer that quickly because I don't think it's live yet. I think it's in formation.
Okay.
But I know we have to transition to our next presenter now. So really interesting. We could talk about this forever. And so thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating panel. It really takes it into real life and how are we trying to work within our settings and our profession and try to impact some of the systems. And you guys just really did an amazing job with that. Carrie, did you have one more thing to say?
No, that was an accident. Sorry.
Okay, just checking. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to do the introduction for our next speaker, and we're very, very lucky to have her. I'm really honored to present to you Saba Mwine. She's the managing director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute at the USC Price School of Public Policy. She leads a collaboration of over 70 researchers and policymakers, having worked at the both national and local levels to establish equity initiatives and incorporating her training in theater, as well as education and leadership. She's my role model for creating trauma-informed practices in professional workspaces. And I'm really happy to introduce you to Saba.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Brenda. You're my role model too. Thank you. And thank you to all the presenters. I learned so much from all that you shared. And I feel that we have such alignment in our presentations. And so I just want to call our attention to the fact that we have all of these similar themes. I think a lot of times people think equity is this sort of nebulous thing, or you might hear that in kind of endeavoring in the work, or you might feel that way. So I just want us to take a moment to sort of acknowledge that for ourselves, that there are things that we can look to. And I know we've already spent a few hours together. So I want us to start with just an opportunity to re-engage with our physical selves. A lot of us have said over the course of the morning, have talked about trauma, have talked about racial trauma, and we know that it lives in our bodies. And so a lot of the work that I aim to do is very experiential. So knowing that, we may be triggered by some of even these topics. And so I want to invite you to just take an acknowledgement or a check-in with your body right now. And you can feel free to close your eyes, and you can feel free to just look and see where or if there is being any tension held. You can do a little bit of a scan starting at your toes. Feel free to close your eyes and going up through your legs and into your hips. Many of us hold tension there. Checking in. How is your lower back? Going up your spine. Your upper back. Your shoulders. Is there any tension being held in your arms? In your scalp? And what about the muscles in your face? Thinking about our jaw and how much it does for us, that particular muscle. But what about your eyebrows? Tension in your hands. And now I'll invite us to, with your eyes closed, if you're able, to look up to the center of your forehead. And we'll just take a few moments of meditation together. There's no wrong way to do it. There are many options for meditation. So just inviting us just to have soft focus on that center point, our forehead. And if you have thoughts, that's okay. Imagine them like clouds passing on a blue sky. And now I want to invite us to take some breaths together as a community. You can imagine us maybe sitting together in a circle in some beautiful place of nature of your choice. And I invite you to put your hand on your heart. And first, just take a moment of gratitude for your beautiful heart, for the empathy, for the physical strength, and now let's go ahead and take a deep inhale and exhale. Now we're going to do an inhale again. And exhale with sound. Yes. And another inhale. And exhale with sound and movement. And shake it out. Now slowly wiggle your toes and open your eyes. And I'd like to invite you to observe how you're feeling now. How is your state of being? And again, I want to invite folks in their anti-racist practice to explore some mindfulness meditations. And you can do a sound one, you can do a movement one. And so with that moment of peace, we shall begin, or I shall continue. And I am going to share my screen. Just going to do a basic screen share for now, but I do have a video that I look forward to sharing in this presentation. And feel free to text me, folks, if I'm going over time. So this is my wish to you. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live your life with ease. And it's a privilege to be in community with each of you. And today we're going to go in a little bit more depth on the topic of racial trauma. And then I'm going to share with you some practitioner and organizational approaches. Many of them intersect with what we've heard today. And then we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A. So looking forward to that. Please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box in the interim, and maybe I can sort of answer some of them as I go along. So understanding that, I know that there was some conversation earlier about this concept of, or at least in our practice session, about how talking about some of this data is traumatizing. Talking about some of our history with race, particularly, I mean, all of our history with race can be traumatizing, all the way from slavery, as Dr. Maddox kind of walked us through, to the disproportionate killing of Black people and Indigenous people by the police. So I just want to acknowledge that and also affirm each of you to take breath as we cover some of the data. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I want you all to have it. And I do want to say that I think it's important to kind of, in delivering any race equity or any presentation around white supremacy, to ground ourselves in the history of our policies. And so we're going to do that. We're going to take an expansive understanding of what racial trauma is. So I like to use art, and to the extent I can, for the reason I mentioned, in terms of like the triggering nature of rehashing and understanding in more depth kind of what communities of color have been experiencing in our nation since its inception. And I think this is a really great illustration because it's showing how essentially throughout our history, white Americans have received affirmative action, basically, in order to move in the world. Whereas there have been a plethora of policies that explicitly or inexplicitly have held Black and Indigenous and POC back, and that these are structural issues that have impacted us on an internalized and interpersonal level. I want to make note of the GI Bill, which is now considered the biggest transfer of economic advantage to white people. And just all of the onslaught on our abilities as Black people, as people of color, to obtain housing, which is the top method of building wealth in the United States. And so whenever we talk about this work, it's important for us to reiterate the structural components that have brought us to the disproportionate representation of people of color in so many of our systems. Racial trauma is and I think it was mentioned before, the disproportionate number of people of color, children of color in the child welfare system. Similarly, a lifetime likelihood of imprisonment of US residents born in 2001 to now, so 21 years. And in here we see that 1 in 18 Black women and 1 in 45 Latinas and 1 in 3 Black men and 1 in 6 Latino men are represented in that population. I was happy to hear about the conversation on racial trauma. I totally learned from what Dr. Mariko had shared. I think that I don't have the data in terms of how race intersects with adverse childhood experiences, but I know from my own lived experiences and others that the systemic conditions that I noted earlier kind of predispose or create conditions that allow for strain on family systems, and of course the intergenerational trauma that many of us have in our bodies, and have haven't had the support from structures to heal in an intentional way, or in a broad enough, there hasn't been enough broad attention to how that intersects, in my view. And then, of course, racial trauma is a disproportionate representation of Black people in the population of people experiencing homelessness in every single state in our nation. And I also want to point out, similarly and this is more or less the same data, but it captures the disproportionate representation of American Indian, Alaska Natives, Indigenous people in our community, in the community of people who experience homelessness in the United States. And so that land and labor theft that was fundamental to our inception as a nation is clearly represented in the data around homelessness. And then I do have a little video that I'm going to put on my advanced sharing, and hopefully it works, to share with you. I'm going to put on my computer audio. That's also a really great way to kind of get through these moments sometimes when you're presenting, is just to say what you're going to do. And this is, okay, here we go. We're kind of making progress. I don't know, can people see the video?
Not right now.
Okay, I'm sharing the wrong thing. I'm going to figure it out. I hope I can figure it out. Let me stop sharing. And then let me do it one more time. Apologies. Okay, here we go.
Take your time.
Oh, thank you. It's really nice to hear that. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Share screen. Okay. Can we see it now or no?
No, but maybe you could just play the sound.
Oh, so smart. Okay.
Started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African-American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the Black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the Black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody Black knows that even though the Black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this Black mother is working in the fields, and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid, he's shiftless, he can't work, because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it.
Okay, I'm just going to stop it here because of time, but thank you for the question about where the video came. So that's Dr. Joy DeGruy. I really recommend her book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. I'm putting the link to the video on here. And I also want to point out the opportunity in storytelling around this work. I think in terms of trying to dismantle white supremacy, it's important for us to lay on some of our universal languages as humans. And I know, Brenda mentioned my background in the arts, and that's something that I really lean on, but also the universal language of storytelling, the universal language of laughter, and all of these things are tools for us to come out of this sort of, I think, illness of white supremacy. It's a pandemic. It's also a social ill. So I just wanted to make that point. And let me just pull my slides back up. Let's see. All right. And so clearly, in terms of what white supremacy and racial trauma is seeing other people that look like you being harmed by systems that are meant to serve you. And I don't think that's lost on any of us, but again, just looking for us to have an expansive understanding of, because sometimes we don't realize that we're being traumatized. I know for me personally, by some of the images that we see, because they're so pervasive. And so I really recommend, and I know, that piece about self-care, and I'm talking to social workers, and that theme of not doing enough of it on our even, when we're caring for others, like not thinking to care for ourselves in the same way. So I take a media diet. There's certain things that I don't watch. I haven't seen the George Floyd video, and that's okay. And that's okay. We can still be responsible people. So now I wanted to provide more of a clinical definition. This I got from a wonderful, wonderful LCSW professor here in Los Angeles, to kind of help us to start to define racialized trauma, and how we can think of racially trauma-informed care. So again, this is a complex form of trauma. And I want to note that this term is not entered in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And I would like to think that we could maybe be part of the community to help that happen, so that people can understand and develop distinct ways to practice racially trauma-informed care. And I just want to note the intersectionality of, say, if you are experiencing the trauma of homelessness, as well as being a person of color, then that is an intersectional pain that that we have to kind of understand in practice. And I know we're kind of getting short on time. So, but let me go through some practitioner and organizational approaches that I found to be helpful. I think we have to have opportunities to have sort of tangible approaches that can be applied to our internalized interpersonal and organizational work, and hopefully are systemic. And so I want to point out that none of these things happen on, say, if you have interpersonal racist experience, that is not siloed from the institutional and systemic. So for example, I'll use myself as an example, and I'll tell a story. For when I was in elementary school, we talked a little bit, someone talked about, I think it was Dr. Maddox that talked about the way that Black children are shuffled into special education because of the systemic racism in an institution. And that was that's what they were trying to do for me. They gave me a test without my mother's permission, and my brother as well. We went to a predominantly white school, And I sustained from that a sense of internalized racism that came to me through an interpersonal interaction with the teacher that was not addressed at the institutional level on any level. There were no policies within the school around that. And even in the school system, in the systemic level, there was no opportunity for it to even be named, right? Even though the data was there, it was the fault of the students rather than the system. And so again, back to that piece about how we have to continue to hold our systems responsible, because white supremacy will blame the individuals. White supremacy will take a focus on individual bodies rather than a systemic issue. I like to think of a great analogy that I learned at this Race Equity Institute training, and I invite people to look them up, where they talk about the allegory or the story of a pond. And you're the caretaker of this pond, and you notice that, okay, one fish has died. And then the next day, a couple of other fish have died. And you're like, I wonder what that fish did to get sick. Or I guess that fish had done something illegal. So it made sense that they could, get killed by the cops because they were in the wrong. And then the next day, more fish are sick. And so I just want to illustrate the thinking around pathologizing the fish rather than asking, well, what's in the groundwater? What is in the water that is poisoning us? And I want to land on the ideology, which I think I mentioned earlier, undergirds all of our ways of being in the United States, from our policies, from our systems, from our history. And so we have to constantly interrogate that. Then I guess you guys will have these slides, and I just wanted to offer, again, this is Dr. Wendy Ashley's, some ways of practicing racially trauma-informed care. Again, I think that overall theme is to acknowledge it and to continue, of course, on your anti-racist practice with transparency, and even in the client, the relationship with clients. I also have a handout that will be made available to you, made available to you. I think a lot of times in our work around this subject, we talk about anti-racism, we talk about racism, but we don't talk about the tenets of white supremacy. So I was really happy about the name of this conference, because it's naming the thing. Because again, white supremacy doesn't really want to look at itself. It'll call itself, oh, we want to, we don't want to be racist, instead of really understanding the nature of white supremacy and how it shows up. And I want to offer this as a tool that you can take back to your organizations. And the way I like to facilitate this exercise is to have people break out into small groups and pick one of these elements of white supremacy culture. In the handout, you'll see it described. And all of us are going to start to, it's not like anything of it is new. In fact, we're all swimming in it, but we haven't examined the elements of it. So it's a very simple practice to change our consciousness and awareness, to go ahead and get in those small groups, discuss it, and then everyone report out, and then invite people to use that knowledge in the particular work that you're doing in your agency. Adult learning has to be applied. We have to apply it as soon as we have it. But it's vital for us to have shared understanding in this work, because we're very new on the path of naming these things. And so we need to have a shared understanding, because like Dr. Maddox said, this is collective work. And lastly, many of you were talking about culturally relevant services, culturally appropriate services. I want to make the pitch for a culturally specific model. And so and I recommend this paper. That model is basically telling us that we need to, in order to develop a sense of belonging, especially with clients that have experienced so much trauma as the work that you're doing, we have to just acknowledge that the people that we're serving need to be represented in our organizations. And that we need to take a culturally specific approach in serving the people that we're working with. If we're predominantly working with African-American people, we need to bring those cultural practices and create a sense of safety around that, and a racially affirming environment. And it does improve client retention. And also it's investing into the community wealth. So if you have Black and Brown leadership, that's investing wealth into the community. And then I also want to invite us, and I know, I only have 5 minutes, right? I think
I'm sorry, your time is about up at this point.
Okay. Well, I apologize I didn't get to share more with you about my work, but I invite you to check out the Homelessness Policy Research Institute and some of the ways that we've been kind of working together I've named here. But anyone, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Saba. And I really apologize. You have such amazing, important material. And I really want to acknowledge the fact that you were able to help us experience how important it is and how possible it is to incorporate self-care, taking care of ourselves within our work, as you did today. So I know you have a lot more material. I know that your slides are in the upload, as well as the white supremacy. Can you just also say the name of the book one more time that you mentioned with Dr. Joy?
Yeah, Dr. Joy DeGrew's Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome.
Okay, thank you so much.
And I can put a link in the chat as well.
Okay, now what I'd like to do is move on and do an introduction for a friend and a colleague who I am so happy to have with us. She's taught me so much about the importance of lived experience advocacy, because she's such a good role model for how it can be done effectively. Reba Stevens is well known in Los Angeles as an advocate by every elected official, all of the homeless program directors, many of the mental health directors, and many who've been unhoused alike. She's dedicated to using her passion and skill at communications on all those levels to advocate for people who are homeless and residents who need and use mental health services in Los Angeles County. She's committed to ensuring responsive, accessible services to those most in need, and has served as an appointee to multiple, and I say multiple, advisory boards, consistently speaking up to give an effective voice to consumers who may otherwise never be heard. And I'm proud to have you as part of this conference and appreciate the opportunity to work with you. Reba.
Thank you so much, Brenda, first and foremost, for the invitation to be here. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Maddox, Bridgid, Carrie, Nancy, and thank you so much, Saba, for allowing us an opportunity and creating the space for us to breathe with all of the information in which we had received, and reminding us of the importance of our breath. So I truly appreciate you for that. I'm going to go a whole different way in which I had thought I was going to go after being in this space today. And I want to start off by sharing with you that not only am I an advocate for others, I too experienced 21 years of my life unhoused on the streets of Los Angeles, alcohol and drug addiction. I drank alcoholically and used drugs for 21 years of my life. Not to feel the feelings and the thoughts that were going on inside of my head as a result of the journey in which I was on. But it's also important to highlight and uplift that we are today in May is Mental Health Month. And so as we celebrate and be educated and informed around mental health, but as an end user of mental health services and care, it's important for me also to remind each and every one of you that mental health is every day for me, because it's important that I am taking care of my mental and emotional health and exercises and practicing mindfulness, many forms of mindfulness practices. It's critical in order for me to to remain housed as I am, to remain sober as I am. My sobriety date is July the 11th of 1998. I've been housed since 2000 and have not fallen back into homelessness. And I want you to know that I did that twice previously. But in reference to the conversation that we've had, I think that it's really important for you to clearly know on my journey, I came from a household where my mother had 12 children and I was emotionally abused, but I didn't recognize that because it was a part of just the culture and the environment in which I lived. I came from a household where children were seen and not heard. And so we didn't talk about feelings. I didn't even understand how to articulate a feeling. I just knew that I felt messed up. When I was out in those streets, I felt effed up, and either that or I was happy. And I drank when I was happy. I drank when I was sad. It was a mess. But there came a day after being in 10 treatment facilities and 12 arrests in those 21 years that I was facing 4.5 years in prison on a 3-year joint suspension with an enhancement. And I was graced by God to go into a treatment facility. But there came this time when I was introduced to healthcare, because as a part of being a resident, you went to the doctor, which was something that I was not doing while I was out on the streets. And the doctor walked in and said, "How are you doing today, Miss Stevens?" Sincerely, and I felt it. And it was then and there that I broke down and was clinically referred to Augusta Hawkins Mental Health Center. When I arrived to that appointment that I needed so bad, I was told that my appointment had been canceled and would be rescheduled in 30 days. And so what I want you to clearly understand is it took a lot of courage for me to walk through those doors. And I demanded to be seen. Interesting enough, that was at 8 o'clock in the morning. At 2:30 that afternoon, there was a beautiful woman by the name of Dr. Lorraine Norman, who came out and met with me and sat with me for 2.5 hours. It was a white woman. But for the first time in my life, I felt heard, I felt cared for, and I went into a deep place. When I arrived back to the treatment facility, because I was at this appointment for so long, I was asked with a returning appointment back to the mental health. I was released from that program. I was put out. Now remember, I'm facing 4.5 years of prison. And I had her card and I called her. During this particular time, they were doing what's called like socials or psychosocials. I might be pronouncing it incorrectly for all of you professional folks who know what I'm talking about. And a psychological testing that happened for me. But what's important is I always thought growing up, because of the way in which I was reared, not to tell anyone my business. Don't you tell nobody. And you don't trust me. And this was a part of what I was taught. This was a woman who saved my life. And it's really important for me to share with you that what it really means to meet people where they are. And for me to not feel judged as I had in the past about the color of my skin and whether or not I deserve care and what it was that I really needed and how to approach me. I took some notes during this session today. And so for me, it's about expressing to you as providers that you must look within yourself to understand your own biases. That racism cannot be solved in a day, and it's something in which we all have to work on. And what I am doing in order to be healthy or to be healthier and to be whole is to use what I call a stop method. And I would invite you to also consider using this stop method. And it's to stop, to think, to observe, and to practice. And the key word in all of this is about practice. It's about practicing and understanding what it is that I'm experiencing, what it is I want, what I don't want, what I'm willing, and what I'm not willing to do. And when we're in these spaces talking about race and racism or anti-racism and policies and structures, it's really important that we are also welcoming and inviting those of us with lived experience to be a part of the conversation They help shape the policies, to help you to better understand what it feels like, what it looks like, what it smells like when we're utilizing your services. It's critical because without the voices and the lens of the person on the receiving end of those services, how do we really shape them fairly? This is one, and I know that I only have a very short time, but this is a book that I embrace, you know, how to be an anti-racist. And there is a statement in this book that I want to share with you, that the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it. So when I think about policies and how policies are written and how policies are developed in the designs of them all, the question for me is always, through what lens and who are you as the policy maker or the designer or the entity or the agency that is creating this policy or working on this policy, not just as the author, but in the day. Who are you in the day that you're in, you know, and where are you? The other is around this quote from Believe It or Not. It's from one of my favorites, Albert Einstein, who says, "The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, or we could say are racist, but because of those who look on and do nothing." It is all of our responsibility to name it, call it out, you know, insist and push for change. But it's also important for to be aware and informed of the culture of the environment in which you're working. Because if we are not aware of that culture, how do you stand up? And then it's also important that we don't just talk about, you know, this arty thing, anti-racist, diversity, inclusion, inequities. We can't just talk about that. We have to be about that. We have to be willing to, for those who wear a badge, when you have that badge on or that hat on and you're representing an agency or entity, it's also important for agencies and entities from the top, on the executive level, to remember that the people that are serving people are people themselves. Treat us the way in which you would want to be treated. How do we create that culture? And when we're talking about an equity lens, my question has always been, what is that lens? You know, do you wear it every day? Do you wear it after 5? You know, do you wear it in the supermarket? Because it's critical. I don't know how much time I have left, Brenda.
You have a couple more minutes.
Okay, so I want to say this. This experience, I feel like I was the fly on the wall in here today because I am an end user of services. And rarely are we invited into spaces and to hear conversations about what folks are doing in the workplace and how we're adjusting or making changes, because this is a conversation that only has started a very few years ago. I'm also a member, I was a member of the ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness. We did a report that collected roughly about 67 recommendations. I would encourage you to read that report. Why? Because it's going to also help and uplift for you to be aware that it's just not about the ad hoc committee on Black people looking at homelessness and the overrepresentation of Black people experiencing it, but the intersections. And so I can truly identify with many intersections. I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. And so I have a whole lot in which I believe that I have to offer or to bring into this current system. But it's also about recognizing the importance of the voices of people with lived experience, but creating guardrails and support around us and protective measures in order for us to feel safe, healthy, whole, and be able to speak in our authentic voices. But I welcome you to also find your voice, you know, and how do I address uncomfortable conversations? Because there was, they ask about that. I've learned to stop, you know, think. observe, and practice leaning into discomfort. And that is something else that I would offer. How do we do that? It's a very difficult task to do. I have a 22-year-old son who's never been in any trouble, an excellent student, studying engineering, soon to graduate, and has a job. And I have never, and I have 4 children. And because of the adequate, appropriate services that I receive, that not only help me by showing up every week or every other week to a session, but gave me tools to help me to learn the importance of living, and that every day is a beautiful day. You know, and who am I and what am I going to do with it? But it's, I'm just excited to have been invited to be a part of this conversation. And I'll leave you with this, that as healthcare providers, and especially for those of us, that it is truly important that we are asked sincerely, what is it that we need and what is it that we want? And that you are listening to us with an open mind to meet those needs, because it is critical for us to be able to actually find a journey, or I should say, began a journey of recovery, and to build a solid, unshakable foundation beneath us. You know, I have some dark clouds in my life today that came from a place where I began to realize that, oh my God, I'm in a twilight zone. And the truth of the matter is that if it wasn't for the foundation, the solid, unshakable foundation that I'm standing on, I would not be able to withhold. And I'll share this with you as well. And this is truly my closing remark. That when I am experiencing discomfort or uncomfortability, and it is not in my control, I feel powerless, I am very grateful for every person who has touched my life, that was empowering to me, that I was able to think about what it is that I want to say or what it is that I want to do, and to also embrace and understand the importance that when I don't know what to do, that I do nothing. And this is about being healthy and whole. So thank you again, Brenda. Thank you to all of the presenters. And last, I want to make sure that I thank Renee, who's going to be doing our closing remarks today. So again, thank you.
Reba, you did it again. You brought tears to my eyes. Thank you so much for, you pulled it all together, and the messages that you sent were just beautiful and crucial. So to wrap it up and bring us to our close for this morning, I would like to introduce to you our final speaker, Renee Wyatt. She's a dear member from our Women's Council. She's currently the Housing Program Manager for a New Way of Life Reentry Project, and has 20 years of experience working with marginalized populations in Los Angeles as a mental health therapist, personal service coordinator, and money management specialist. And she's been featured in almost all of our conferences, and we're just so happy that she's here today. Renee?
Thank you. Thank you. Oh gosh, this has been really amazing. If we were in a room together, I would be yelling and screaming because of the information that was disseminated here. It has been really informative for me. But my part of this is the closing statement. And so I titled it Hope for Change, the Growth and Stamina of the Social Work Profession. As I contemplated what I wanted to convey in this statement, I was reminded of my love and passion for the work that I do, that we do as a whole. In defining social work, I looked at Wikipedia, hoping to find a more liberal meaning. And this is what it said. Social work is an academic discipline and practice-based profession that concerns itself with individuals, family groups, communities, and society as a whole in an effort to meet basic needs and enhance social functioning, self-determination, collective responsibility, optimal health, and overall well-being. And what I realized is basically the same as, let's say, the NSW definition, or what we know as our profession. So I was looking up some research. I researched some people who started the social work profession, like Jane Addams, her contribution of Whole House in 1889. Alfred Newman's substantial contribution to persecuted Jewish families during the Holocaust. Francis Fieldman's devoted career to studying the human experience from an occupational lens, exploring discrimination against cancer survivors in the 1970s. Ida B. Wells, A Bridge for Newly Freed African Americans Through the South. She was the first person to document lynching of African Americans, an important part of the anti-lynching campaign. And let's not forget about Mahatma Gandhi, nonviolent protests while living and working in South Africa. These 5 key figures worked tirelessly, legitimizing the social work profession. Our bold beginnings in the 1800s catapulted the social work profession because of the need for programs dedicated to addressing urbanization, poverty, and immigration. Programs like the Association of the Improvement of the Condition of the Poor and the Children's Aid Society. During the Civil War, major social welfare initiatives emerged, such as the American Red Cross. Now look, I could go on about the history of our profession, but it's not necessary. You can look at the years you have tirelessly worked toward legitimizing the profession, living up to the profession's ethics and values. Our growth over the years has been amazing, from establishing the first social work class in 1904 at the Boston School of Social Work to creating the National Association of Social Work in 1955. Yes, this is an amazing profession, and I'm so proud to be a part of it. And moving forward, as we continue to grow, change, well, it's inevitable. We can no longer overlook a system rooted in white supremacy with its systemic injustices. As one of the most influential professions God created, we need to stand together to reimagine how we can move away from positive and negative disadvantages based on race or income status. We are a diverse community of gifted individuals called by God to join together to eliminate injustices that create homelessness, discrimination, poverty, recidivism, and much more. I encourage all my sisters and brothers to focus on their strengths and abilities in an effort to find a solution to the problems we face, letting go of the past and doing better in the future. And as I listened to the speakers, one of the things that was profound, or I wrote down, was Dr. Conn's statement: the work will not be comfortable or easy. So as a professional, a social worker, LCSW, MFT, service provider, change agent. I mean, I've heard all of these titles that we carry. In my heart of hearts, we are an amazing group of gifted and talented people. And what a time to live where we are called to make a change in the world so significant that we may not even be here to see the outcome. But I and we get to live today to make that change, to take the first step forward, to join together in this hard to say situation, anti-race. That's a big, almost cussed, you guys, a big word. That's a big, it's a few letters, but look how big it is. It is huge, right? But look, I got all y'all. I see it was like 90 people on this training. I got all y'all to stand with me or to take me with you, whichever comes first. But we all got here some kind of way. And the only way we're going to get out of it is together. So thank you.
Thank you, Renee. That was beautiful. I felt your passion, and I just felt inspired by the vision of what we can become with the energy and the passion and the knowledge that we all contain. And we're a good army to keep moving things forward. So I appreciate your message of hope. This has been an amazing day. I personally have been moved and inspired and learned some important things, and appreciate all of you who've been attending with us. I do want to remind you that we do have one more day of our conference. If you'd like to attend, there's nothing that says you have to, but if you do, then you get your 6 CEUs for your law and ethics licensure training, and you're good to go for the year. Our second session will be held on May 20th. It will run from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And the focus is going to be on child welfare. We thought a lot about where we could go once we've laid the foundation of the work we talked about here today. And we realized that child welfare is a social work institution. We really own it. How do we protect and take care of children and families? And we also felt the need to really do a deep dive in understanding how that system came out of racism and how it has perpetuated some things that were very unkind and harmful to people who have ended up being in that system, of course, disproportionately based on their race and color. And so we've got a wonderful program that's going to really look at how we could understand and transform that system. And we hope that you'll join us for the next time. I do want to remind you, as soon as we're done here, what we want you to do is go back to your landing page on the platform where you started, and there will be a button that says complete evaluation, I think. So go ahead and do that, and then you'll be getting a certification or certificate for the 3 CEs that you have received today. And so other than that, I just again want to thank you. If there's any technical issues, please, you can go on the CE Go website if you're not getting your certificate or you're having trouble managing that. Feel free to reach out to myself, or I got some emails on our email for the Women's Council. And I just again want to thank all the members of the Women's Council that included our panelists, Carrie and Renee, and then Debbie and Hillary and Laura, who all helped us. We're all volunteers, so we meet and we talk and we figure out what we want to share with you and what we want to hear so that we can get our CEUs. And we hope to see you again in 2 years. So is there anything else anyone wants to announce or say from our panelists before we end that I missed? Okay, we're good. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.